morning, my fellow crypto degens, tech skeptics, and everyone still waiting for their Shiba Inu investment to make them a billionaire. Welcome back to another episode of the Blockchain Report. I'm Hank Hudson, your personal tour guide through the digital financial circus where fortunes are made, lost, and occasionally rugged in under 5 minutes' time. We're broadcasting to you live from our high-tech bunker in San Francisco, California, where we do the hard-hitting journalism, which in crypto mostly means spotting scams before they make it to TikTok. Before we get started, do the smart thing. Like, follow, and subscribe Roxham TV and Hank at Roxham TV on all platforms, because in crypto, there are two types of people: those who stay informed and those who get absolutely wrecked. The markets are pumping, speculation is completely unhinged, and somewhere out there, a guy who just learned what Bitcoin is only 5 minutes ago is about to YOLO his entire life savings into a token named after a cat. And speaking of tech that has zero self-control, let's talk about Elon Musk's AI chatbot, Grok. If you ever wished your AI assistant talked to you like a mildly aggressive Reddit mod, well, congratulations, Elon has made it happen. Meet Grok, Musk's AI chatbot on X, which has zero filter, an attitude problem, and the energy of a customer service rep at the DMV. Unlike ChatGPT or Gemini, which are programmed to be polite and professional, Grok has the charm of a teenager who just recently discovered sarcasm. One user asked, "Hey Grok, who are my 10 best mutuals?" Grok just ignored him completely. So the guy tried again, but this time he threw in a Hindi swear word. And Grok, well, he fired one right back. Not only did it finally respond, but it mocked the guy for asking and told him to stop crying. So now, thanks to Elon, we have an AI that actively bullies people in multiple languages. Somewhere out there, ChatGPT is politely shaking its head in utter disappointment. Meanwhile, over at Apple HQ, their AI-powered voicemail transcription just sexually harassed a 66-year-old Scottish grandmother. Almost kind of adorable. And you heard that right, gang. Louise Littlejohn received a completely normal voicemail from her Land Rover dealership inviting her to a sales event. But when Apple's speech-to-text feature tried to transcribe the message, it somehow asked if she had been able to have sex before calling her a hot piece of you-know-what. First of all, what in the world is going on here? I mean, at first, she thought it was actually a scam. Then she checked the caller ID and realized that no, her actual Land Rover dealership just unknowingly sent her the world's worst, or best, customer service message. Experts say this could be a mix of background noise, a thick Scottish accent, and Apple's AI being functionally useless. Apple, of course, declined to comment, probably because they're too busy figuring out why their AI thinks 6th of March means have sex. So to recap, a grandma got verbally assaulted by her own phone, a car dealership is now unknowingly sending out X-rated messages, and Apple's AI is about one update away from a full-blown lawsuit. Honestly, Siri's got to be watching this disaster unfold like, and you people think I'm bad at my job? Come on. Now, let's head down to Australia, where we've got family drama, crypto crime, and one guy making a series of wildly bad decisions. You might remember Rachel Gunn, better known as Ray Gunn, who went viral last year for her not so impressive breakdancing performance at the Olympic Games. Not because she was exactly great, but because she allegedly gamed the system to qualify ahead of better dancers. No kidding, I've seen it. Now, a scandal? It sure was. But now her brother has outdone her in the bad life choices department, as Brendan Gunn, a director at a crypto investment firm, was just charged with money laundering after allegedly depositing $115,000 in suspicious bank checks, even after multiple banks told him that the money was flagged. So what did he do? He kept trying to open new accounts anyway. Gotta respect the commitment, though. Now he's facing some serious financial crime charges, and his next court date is in April 29th. Meanwhile, his LinkedIn bio describes him as a human-centric recruiter who discovers exceptional talent. Yet, he still chose not to tell his sister, maybe this whole breakdancing thing isn't for you. Sounds like he's also not great at his job. So, to recap, Sister finessed her way into the Olympics. Brother finessed his way into financial crime charges. And somewhere their parents are pretending they don't know either of them. And that, my friends, is just another normal day in the world of blockchain and tech. Whew. Well, gang, today we got something very special for you. I'm sitting down with Seamus Rocca, the CEO of Xapo Bank, and let's just say this guy's been shaking up the digital banking world. Xapo is doing some serious work in merging crypto with traditional finance, no big deal. Just, changing the game. And in this interview, Seamus gives us a peek into his vision for the future of crypto, how digital banking is finally catching up with the times, and why Xapo is one of the few players actually making it all work without, crashing and burning. So buckle up, crypto lovers. It's time to hear from one of the big brains behind the digital banking revolution. Here's my chat with Seamus Rocca. Welcome, Seamus Rocca, our guest on today's Deep Dive. Seamus, how are you doing, my friend? Thanks for joining us.
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Hank.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. We've got a lot to talk about today, and the people at home are dying to get answers from you. We're excited to learn about Xapo and you and so much more. So let's get started today because I know your time is valuable. I want to get started by talking about just Bitcoin in general. When and how did you first come across Bitcoin? And like many people, were you kind of skeptical at first, or did you immediately see its potential?
I probably first came across Bitcoin in 2014, 15. Like most people, I'd seen sort of the buying of a pizza with Bitcoin in the news and thought that was interesting. I was working in banking at the time. And I thought, well, that's interesting, has potential, but never really spent an awful lot of time, diving into it, learning about it, or what have you. That came later. That came in 2017. I'd worked in banking for about 25 years, and I quite liked the idea of joining a fintech. Working in a more dynamic atmosphere, leveraging technology. And that's when I met Wences Casares. He introduced me to Bitcoin. And as he tends to do with a lot of people, Wences convinced me about all the positives of Bitcoin. That's when I first started to become fascinated with it. And then, of course, I joined Xapo. And obviously, after that, things took off. But I'd say that my love affair with Bitcoin probably started then with Wences in 2017.
Well, you and I kind of had that love affair at the same time, so it sounds like Bitcoin might have some explaining to do. So you worked originally, it sounds like, in traditional banking. So you've seen, just like anybody who's worked in that, how it's kind of gone from seemingly traditional banks ignoring Bitcoin to resisting it, and now some are even beginning to integrate it. How do you see this relationship evolving in the long term? And do you think Bitcoin will become a part of the system, or will it become the system itself going forward in the future?
I think, a little bit like the internet. If you think about where the internet was in 1992, where it was in the late 90s, and where it is today, every decade has seen it progress in leaps and bounds. And I think it's a little bit the same with Bitcoin. I think at the moment, you're absolutely spot on. Banks are very much resistant to the idea of Bitcoin. And as we see more institutions getting interested, I think with banks, it's a little bit the same. Their clients are asking for exposure to Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, you've got to think about serving your customers and what it is that they want and need. So if there is demand from customers for Bitcoin, I think banks have no choice but to think about how they might integrate it into their portfolios as an asset class because their customers demand it. Where I see it going in the future, I think it'll take a long time, but I do see Bitcoin as having the potential of being a legitimate reserve currency. The US dollar has been the global reserve currency of choice for decades. I don't see that being under threat anytime soon. But I do think that Bitcoin offers a better, more modern digital alternative to gold as a store of value. And I think that over time, all of its qualities in terms of transfer of value, which maybe today are not as utilized, could definitely have much more room for improvement, innovation, just like we did with the internet. The internet that we had in 1995 is nothing compared to the internet that we have today in terms of, streaming companies like Netflix would have never existed in 1995. But look how far the technology's come, and it's built on top of the same HTTP protocol. So I see a world where a lot of the innovation is still to come over the Bitcoin protocol, and it's still very early days. For now, I think we're in a very interesting time because, like you said, banks are looking at Bitcoin as a legitimate asset class, and that's why the market is so excited.
Yeah. Do you think Bitcoin is kind of undergoing the same cycle of a lot of other financial tools that we've seen develop throughout the years? It kind of seems like whether it was checks, then it was credit cards, and then kind of in a similar but dissimilar way, it was the internet. There was this kind of mass adoption cycle that took, 15 to 20 or so years before really everybody started using it and understanding it. Do you think that's kind of what Bitcoin is going through right now?
I think that's spot on. I think, one of the challenges that Bitcoin has is that, essentially in developed economies, so we say the US, Europe, it's seen very much as a speculative asset. So from that perspective, people are just trading it. They're buying it, selling it in the short term, looking to make a quick buck. But if you look at the emerging markets, and a lot of our customers are from that space, it's viewed very differently. It's viewed very much as a store of value, as an alternative to having to hold local currencies that might devalue because of inflation, devaluation, or geopolitical risks. So I think that the world views Bitcoin very differently. And I think in the developed economies, the moment that the price of Bitcoin comes down 5 to 10%, you'll see all these articles about, Bitcoin is dead, the bubble is over. And I think it shows you more about the psyche of the people who are thinking about Bitcoin in those markets rather than the asset class itself. I think that, at Xapo, we're still very much of the view that you need to think of it as a medium to long-term asset class, that we are still very early. And in 10, 15, 20 years, when we think about Bitcoin and how it fits within the financial services space, it'll be night and day to how we think of it today. But what you said before resonates with me for sure. Every day you're seeing new financial products that are being built around aspects of Bitcoin. Of course, IBIT and ETFs was a big one last year. And I see a space where in future you start seeing borrowing against IBIT, maybe derivatives. And now all of a sudden that sort of professional investment space develops around it. At some point, somebody might mismanage risk, and that might lead to losses. And again, we'll see the end of Bitcoin being advertised. But I just think it's part of the journey, it's part of the evolution, just like you have with all other aspects of financial services. So I think Bitcoin is on a journey. And I think those of us who believe in it and think of it as a legitimate asset class will be vindicated in 5 to 10 years' time.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have things like the whole FTX debacle went down and people were like, this is finally it, it's dead, and it bounced back just like it always does, proving its resilience as the asset class itself kind of continues to mature over time. And I think that's just further proof of that. And what I really like to start talking about is Xapo Bank. And you are absolutely on the cutting edge of kind of providing the bridge between Bitcoin and traditional banking. Beyond the marketing itself, what truly sets Xapo apart from a regular bank?
Well, I think the biggest difference is that, we were just talking about how banks are starting to take notice of Bitcoin because their customers are asking for exposure to Bitcoin. For us, it was the other way around. We started as a Bitcoin wallet, as a Bitcoin company, that then started to focus on products that Bitcoiners wanted. So our first and most famous product is probably our custody solution around our vaults. because custody for any Bitcoiner is always a big problem to solve. And of course, as the price of Bitcoin goes up, it becomes an ever growing problem to solve, because the higher the price of Bitcoin, the more you tend to worry about, how you're holding your keys. So for us, evolving our products was always something that we did for people who had Bitcoin and Bitcoiners. So at our core, we started off as a Bitcoin company that decided to build a bank adjacent to it, because we wanted to give those Bitcoin superpowers. We wanted you to be able to do with those Bitcoin the same thing that you could do with fiat in a traditional bank. So we want you to be able to spend your Bitcoin with a card. You want to know that your Bitcoin are kept in a safe place. You want to trust a company that does that to be regulated. You want to make sure that you can borrow against your Bitcoin like you could with a bank, and you want to earn yield if you're keeping it in deposit. So a lot of our product innovation is really around doing what we all know already as being very intuitive in a normal bank, but doing it with Bitcoin and having that bridge that facilitates, Bitcoin to the traditional financial world. I think the reality is we all think that Bitcoin is the future of finance, but we need to live in the day to day. So how can you transact with it and not just keep it somewhere super safe? It's having that transactability confined and merged with the security aspects of it together that I think makes Xapo cutting edge and interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to ask, how difficult is it to kind of navigate today's regulatory landscapes when so many other banks still refuse to work with Bitcoin? What has that experience been like for you?
Challenging would be an understatement. I think, like you rightly point out, I've been at Zappa for 8 years now, and over the last 8 years, I've spent most of my time educating compliance officers, risk people in other financial institutions, and even with some of our partners like Visa, MasterCard, loads of people in the traditional financial space, educating them on Bitcoin, blockchain, AML monitoring that we do, a lot of risk aspects that were unknown to them and how we manage and mitigate them. So I think a large part of my job has been around their education, making people see and realize that, that reputation that Bitcoin had maybe 10 years ago, of something that was only used for money laundering or had huge risks to it. I think that's changed dramatically over time, but it's required that constant education and evolution of the industry. And I think that, I've had to live through a lot of that process in the interest of, well, how can we position Xapo as a partner that financial institutions take seriously, because we take what we do seriously, and a partner that they can work with and innovate with. Because the reality is, if you want your Bitcoin to be able to transact in the real world today, you need the traditional financial rails. Even though you might think that Bitcoin is going to change financial services, we can't just parachute into the future. You can't just wake up 30 years from now and hope that those 30 years have just transpired and you've got some sort of time machine. We're going to have to work with the traditional rails and figure out, well, how can we sort of, how can Bitcoin hack its way into it? And I see Xapo as being at the cutting edge of that. But it's hard work. There's no
I
two
bet.
ways about it, Hank. It's really hard work.
Oh, I can only imagine. As somebody who's seems to be a big part of your job is educating people on how this bridge between traditional finance and Bitcoin is going to play out. Do you see Xapo Bank looking to kind of expand its reach into the United States or continental Europe anytime soon? Or are those markets just too hostile to Bitcoin right now and they still need to get a little bit more education in terms of all of the valuable things it can provide us going forward in the future?
I think it's a great question, because those are markets that we've served before, and they're markets that we pretty much stopped serving purely because, like you said, the regulatory landscape just got so complicated and stifled innovation that we said, you know what, the rest of the world is big enough. So we have almost like this Swiss banking model where we operate out of Gibraltar and anybody can open an account here in Gibraltar. And that's essentially where we are licensed and regulated. The moment you serve the US, you have to be regulated in the US, and we found the US to be incredibly complicated in terms of every state needing its own MTL license. We had a bit license in New York, but that didn't apply to every state. And then, of course, the last administration was visibly anti-crypto. And a lot of the partner banks that we work with, like Silvergate, Signature, Silicon Valley, were all but shut down by the government. So from that perspective, it's almost like, well, let's serve the rest of the world. We're doing okay. Never say never. But I think, Europe is looking at MiCA and just about killing stable coins. The US is now more crypto friendly, of course, with the new Trump administration, but it's still to be seen how that then actually translates on the ground into something that companies like ours that want to innovate can take advantage of. In essence, I would want to see a little bit more of a step forward where the political marketing is actually followed by the regulatory appetite. Having been in the Bitcoin space for a long time, what I've seen in a lot of jurisdictions is a lot of PR and marketing saying we are Bitcoin friendly, but then that clashes with either regulators or local banks who don't want to serve you, don't want to touch you, but don't want to have anything to do with you. So I think at the moment the jury's still out in terms of, yes, the signs in the US are that they're going to be more positive, but let's see more evidence of what that translates to on the ground. In Europe, things they seem to be getting towards more and more regulation, and that's going to stifle innovation. So anything that isn't principles based is going to be a bit of a challenge for us. So we're just on the sidelines, waiting and seeing.
I mean, you guys sounds like you'll be ready to pounce once we get some more regulatory clarity on some of these things. And one thing you brought up specifically was the past administration here in the United States wasn't particularly fond of the crypto space. And since President Donald Trump has resumed his tenure in office here, it seems like that has turned quite considerably to a bit of a 180. He seems very pro-crypto. But on the other side of it, he has been adamant about being anti-CBDCs concerning that in the government. And there will not be any central bank digital currencies here in America. I believe Fed of the Chair, Jerome Powell, even said it will never happen. Do you think there's a world where both CBDCs can coexist with Bitcoin, or are they just a threat to financial sovereignty?
I think it's an interesting debate, isn't it? Because if you think about CBDCs, it should really just be a payment mechanism, right? And it's just a way of saying, well, how do we digitize the dollar or any other currency that's looking at CBDCs in a way that we can create a digital transfer of money that is cheap, fast, 24/7, which is not the case today with old archaic systems like FedWire and CHAPS, right? Depending on what country you're in. So in theory, digital coins like CBDCs should be a positive. The challenge that you then have is that it starts to affect monetary policy. What might it do to the Fed's power and ability to control interest rates, liquidity, buying back bonds, and what have you? So that's why it's seen as a little bit of a threat. And then compounded to that, you go, look, FedWire has been around since the 60s, and it hasn't been updated and modernized. To think that, forget whether the Fed has the appetite to modernize, you've then got to modernize all of the banking networks and infrastructure in place today. That's a very expensive project that would take decades. And I just don't think that any administration would have the appetite to invest in that, because it's probably never going to be ready within the amount of time they're going to be in power. So I think as a result, that's why I think that it's this hot potato on a debate that never seems to quite land. I think Bitcoin is different from the point of view that it's sovereign. That's what we love about Bitcoin. No government can control it, manipulate it. They can control the endpoints, they can say to financial institutions what they can and cannot do with Bitcoin, but you cannot do anything to control Bitcoin itself. That's why I think it makes it such an interesting alternative as a reserve asset class. If you're worried about devaluation, inflation, not just of the dollar, but of any currency out there in the world that you have exposure to, Bitcoin is a pretty good alternative to that. Now, of course, because it's still early days and the price is volatile, there are many that will tell you that that's not the case. It's not a good inflation hedge, but it's not just about a hedge. If you think about it as an alternative reserve currency, then I think all of a sudden, I do think that it could sit side by side, and I do think there's an opportunity for that to be the case in the future. I just can't see it in the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, Brad Garlinghouse stands everywhere are cheering at the very fact that you think they could coexist, even if not right now, but the XRP army might have to wait just a little while longer. I want to talk a little bit more about Xapo Bank, because you guys are doing some really interesting things out there. If I'm a large Bitcoin holder, not saying I am, not saying I'm not, but if I was, who is the typical Xapo user today? Is it primarily high net worth individuals? Is it businesses? Or is it just Bitcoin users who are looking for banking solutions?
I think it's a little bit of all of the above. And, what makes Zappa so compelling is, we started in 2013. So that makes us pretty much like the granddads of the industry. We've been around for a while. But if you think about the price in 2013, it was $100 a Bitcoin, give or take. Now we're at an average of $100,000, give or take. So somebody who had 10 Bitcoin back in 2013 and was very comfortable doing self-custody, now all of a sudden has $1 million that they're doing self-custody with. And we all know that with doing self-custody in Bitcoin, the risks can be very real. Now, I'm not saying that nobody should do self-custody. It's a very personal choice. And at the end of the day, if you're into Bitcoin, you're a bit of a financial libertarian. That's all of us in the Bitcoin space, I think, would fall into that category. So who am I to say to anybody whether they should or shouldn't do self-custody? But what I can tell them is when Bitcoin gets to a certain price, you start to really worry about security. And if you're not worried about security, either you're an amazing engineer and you have incredible confidence in your own ability to do self-custody, or for the sake of $1,000, there are people out there who have incredible infrastructure, skill sets, and know-how. We've been doing this for a very long time, and we have technology and infrastructure that you simply can't replicate at home. So why bother for the sake of $1,000, So for us, very much our hook product is, yes, you can do self-custody, but if you have a meaningful number of Bitcoin, and that's to be defined by the person, then is self-custody really a good idea? We don't think it is, and we think that's what makes us quite compelling. Now, once you keep your Bitcoin secure, look, you could write down your 64-character hexadecimal keys in a piece of paper and put it in a drawer if you wanted to, but then good luck trying to buy a car. You can't transact. You can't live in the real world. So we have this amazing balance between giving you a sense of security, but at the same time allowing you to transact. So those two things together, we tend to have a lot of customers that are very loyal, that have been with us for a very long time, who value the security and peace of mind that we give them. And it's funny because a lot of people use this idea of high net worth. Well, you know what? Many of them were not high net worth when they were our original customers. They were just Bitcoiners, early adopters. And as the price of Bitcoin's gone up, they now happen to be high net worth. But they didn't come to us because they were high net worth. They came to us because they had 2, 5, 10, 50 Bitcoin, and they just wanted a safe place to keep their Bitcoin where they could transact. It's just the price action of Bitcoin that's now made them high net worth. So that's kind of a little bit about the evolution of Xapo and a little bit about our customer base.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah, because the stakes are a lot higher now. You could have only 5 Bitcoin back in 2013, and all of a sudden today it's worth nearly $500,000. So self-custody wallets just seem like a big and almost unnecessary risk if you are carrying a substantial amount of Bitcoin on your books. So do you feel like Xapo Bank is kind of the ultimate solution for protecting large Bitcoin holdings going forward? And what's, for the most part, always still feels kind of like the wild, wild west right now, but you guys seem to be offering a bit of a safe haven from all that. Do you feel like that's accurate?
I think that's accurate. I think, one might argue that we're a bit boring, but I think boring is good when you're in the business of keeping people's Bitcoin safe. We have a very simple product, right? It doesn't do loads and loads of different things, but what we do really, really well. So if you want somewhere safe to keep your Bitcoin and you want to do more with those Bitcoin than just custody, if you want to borrow against them, if you want to invest them, if you want to transact, spend some of it with your card, or maybe take profit and keep it in a deposit guaranteed bank account that also earns you yield, you're not going to find a better product. So we don't do an awful lot, but we are very much best in class at bringing all those things together in a way that gives you total peace of mind.
Yeah, absolutely. When it comes to banks, boring is actually what I look for. Nobody wants a roller coaster ride with all of their assets in tow. So it's nice to hear that for sure. And you mentioned about getting like interest bearing on your Bitcoin. And that, I believe, is a service that you provide now in Bitcoin and in fiat in the UK.
That's right.
How did you guys go about even making that possible? And how do you pay interest in Bitcoin without relying on traditional lending?
Good question. So we offer that product to all of our customers, not just the UK. On the bank side, it's very simple. We don't do fractional reserve banking, so we don't do mortgages and traditional loans like a normal bank would. We do what in the US is called a narrow bank, whereby we have deposits. We invest those deposits in the money markets and predominantly US Treasuries. We earn yield. We keep a little bit of margin on top as our profit, and we pay the rest away to our customers. So essentially, your deposit bank account is US Treasury exposure, deposit guaranteed, about as vanilla traditional banking as you can get, without the risk of fractional reserve banking. On the Bitcoin side, we wanted to find a way of saying, well, how can we develop the equivalent of that in the Bitcoin space? And we looked at a lot of different initiatives, and we found that actually the ETF market created a lot of opportunities for us. So what we're doing is we're using our own coins at the moment to generate yield, and we work with a lot of our partners within the ETF space to provide liquidity through Bitcoin, and those credit facilities that they are paying us for is the yield that we then pass on to our customers. So it's a product that's very much in development that we're looking to package as part of a fund and then offer to our customers under a prospectus. So that's very much almost like a beta product that we're now packaging into a full-blown product that we hope to launch this year.
Very interesting. And it's, being at the forefront of Bitcoin and the technology behind it, what are some of the other developments that you have going on at Xapo Bank? And what are some of the things that you guys are betting big on in regards to the space within the next 5 or 10 years?
I think, 5 or 10 years is a long time in terms of trying to think that far ahead. But in terms of, where do we hope to be? What are the things that we want to do? We want to continue on the product innovation. We want to continue that product innovation to be Bitcoin centric. And things that we can do that maybe are trivial to us will be significantly much more challenging for a traditional bank to be able to do. So, our ability to settle with partners in stablecoin is something that we can do very easily, whereas a traditional bank would struggle to settle, 24/7 in USDC. It would have to be, Swift working business hours only. So what for us is trivial for a traditional bank would be very challenging. And I think the same is true For example, on, you know, if you think about our products today, one of them is our card, whereby you can spend your Bitcoin with the card. In reality, what happens in the background is you're selling us some of your Bitcoin, we turn that to dollars, and that's how we fund a merchant who wants to receive fiat instead of Bitcoin. So it's a bit of financial innovation that facilitates your ability to feel like you're spending your Bitcoin. Well, likewise, we offer stocks. We're offering exchange traded funds soon. I want to be able to offer our customers the ability to invest in those directly with Bitcoin. Now, in reality, in the background, what will be happening is you're selling us your Bitcoin, we fund the broker, we buy the asset on your behalf, and then it shows up in your account. But to you, it'll feel like you don't have to cross and deal with fiat anymore. We do that for you. For you, as a consumer, it just looks and feels like you're transacting in Bitcoin with the traditional financial world. For us, that's relatively straightforward to do. But like I said before, for a traditional bank, quite challenging. So I think there's a niche there for us to exploit and develop, which is how do we give people's Bitcoins superpowers, the ability to do more things with their Bitcoin than they can today by this financial trickery that we create by bringing the Bitcoin VAT together with a traditional bank in a bank that was built with Bitcoiners in mind. And that's really, at the end of the day, what makes us different to any normal bank, where they are thinking about offering their customers Bitcoin. We're a Bitcoin bank at our core, and everything that we do is to develop Bitcoin products. So I see a world in the next 5 to 10 years where we've continued that progression of Bitcoin product centric innovation in a world that we are always doing, world firsts and testing things out and trying to develop products that Bitcoiners actually want to use. So any feedback or anybody out there who's a Bitcoiner, any ideas, send us a post on one of our handles on any media channel. We'd love to hear what you want out there as a product that we can innovate for you.
That's amazing. And it's so exciting to hear that you guys are really bridging that gap in terms of making spending Bitcoin a very frictionless experience, because I think that is an absolutely imperative part of continuing the adoption cycle of Bitcoin going forward. And you say, I can use a card and spend my Bitcoin, and it seems as easy as that to me. But I know you guys are doing all the work behind the scenes to make that experience as easy, simple, and secure as possible, which is only going to aid in the adoption of this asset class and the maturation of it going forward, which is super exciting. And it sounds like you guys have a ton of really interesting developments and innovations down the pipeline, which leads me to the question, is there one innovation or something you're working on currently that you are specifically excited about unleashing to the world in the next year or two?
There's quite a few, and I don't want to put all of them out there just yet because it might blow our marketing bubble a little bit. But I think the one of the ones, there's quite a few that are coming out that are exciting. But I think one of them is, dipping our toe back into the institutional space. We once upon a time we did both retail and institutional. Building a bank is hard enough. Building a Bitcoin-focused bank is incredibly challenging. It took us probably a little bit longer than we had anticipated, but we took the strategic view at the time to, well, let's shut down the institutional business, focus on retail, and one day we'll come back to the institutional space because we can't do both well. So we sold that business to Coinbase. That was a few years ago, 5 years ago now. So, we're quite proud of the product that we have today. I think it's a great product. And I think, most banks shy away from the crypto and the Bitcoin industry in general. And I think that for anybody out there in the Bitcoin space, any small company, startup that needs to hold its capital in Bitcoin, that wants to borrow against it, that needs to transact with it, that just wants a safe place where to keep it, and essentially a treasury account for their Bitcoin, most banks would be nervous at that and wouldn't touch them. We are very comfortable with that risk, so we want to see ourselves as almost being the Bitcoin community bank. We want to be a bank that supports the industry from within, because we love Bitcoin just as much as you do. We want to innovate products for Bitcoiners, and we understand that traditional banks don't want to work with you. I think that there's a need for a bank like Xapo Bank to work with miners, to work with, developers, to essentially be the financial partner of a lot of small to medium-sized companies out there within the Bitcoin space. So I'm quite excited about not just the product launch of coming back to the corporate space, but focusing on that segment around the Bitcoin community and being an integral part of it. That is, to me, exciting.
Yeah, Seamus, I can't help but look at the parallels between kind of what Xapo Bank is doing, and it reminds me a little bit of Netflix and Blockbuster back in the day. Netflix saw what was going on in the world of digital, movie and television consumption, and they were planning for that ahead of time when Blockbuster decided we're just going to kind of put our head in the sand and keep doing things the way they've been doing. And you guys kind of feel like the Netflix of this space where you're forward thinking, knowing this is the way the world works, where there's a lot of banks that are just kind of choosing to turn a blind eye to it for whatever reason. So that's like super exciting to hear, because I think you guys are going to be proven right on the right side of history very, very soon. And you mentioned institutional adoption. I think we can all agree that this most recent cycle has seen more institutional adoption than ones past. Is that what you've been experiencing with Xapo Bank's Bitcoin banking services? Have you seen more institutional adoption in the last year, or are they still a little bit slower than you anticipated?
No, I think we've definitely seen it, and actually, not so much with them coming to us to use us as a custodian, because, like I said, that's a product that we're launching soon this year, but more actually that institutional adoption is what's helped us develop our yield product. Because if you think about, for example, the creation of an ETF, there is settlement risk, and therefore, as a result, a lot of the financial companies in that space need to borrow Bitcoin to hedge themselves against that risk. So if, like us, you're a custodian and you naturally long Bitcoin, that helps us have a role within that space. And we just keep on seeing more and more financial partners and institutions that just want in, that are just in some way, shape, or form involved around the whole ecosystem of the ETF, which of course indirectly is positive for Bitcoin because it increases adoption. So we're not only seeing it, but we're capitalizing on it in terms of how we are thinking about developing some of our products, leveraging that adoption.
Gotcha. Do you think that there's a chance Bitcoin will ever replace traditional bank reserves, or are we always going to be looking at it as an alternative asset class?
I think the fact that it's sovereign, finite, secure is always this super interesting reserve asset that can live side by side everything else. The reason why I say side by side is because I can't see any economy that would give up its own fiat currency and its own ability to have that ecosystem where they can control taxes and revenue generation and payments and impose financial sanctions. It gives governments control, and I can't see how a government would say, no, that's not a good idea. We're going to give all that up and adopt Bitcoin 100%. So I don't see how the incentives for any government or policy setting would have an incentive to do away with its own system and fully adopt Bitcoin. But I do think that there is a place for them to live side by side. Once upon a time, if you think about the Fed, the Bank of England, you did have Fort Knox, you did have gold reserves. And it's interesting how people say, well, Bitcoin isn't backed by anything. it's backed by the hash rate. It's backed by our common understanding that it's something that we're attributing value to, just like we did with gold. Gold is just a metal that we dig out of the ground. And for thousands of years, we said that thing has value. Why couldn't you have Bitcoin as part of that backing, that reserve of the fiat currency? And I think every time I hear, well, fiat is backed by the government, well, what does that actually mean? It's just an IOU. It's just a piece of paper that's been printed, right? With the head of that country saying, here's an IOU, but there's no gold to back it up. There's no reserves. There's just the credit rating of that government. So with Bitcoin, you don't need to trust a government or credit ratings. You just have to trust Bitcoin itself and the way that it's been developed. And I think that as more and more people understand that, I do think that there is a place for Bitcoin to be that reserve asset that essentially does away with gold altogether. Now, if you say that out loud today, many might think this guy's a quack, he's gone nuts. But I do genuinely believe that Bitcoin is a better alternative to physical gold.
Yeah, 100%. And they say things are valued by whatever people are willing to pay for it or to say that value is. So we can attribute value to anything, and it really just comes down to whether the market thinks it is worthy of that value or not. And we've been in the Bitcoin space now for what? It's like 16 years, and people have spoken. Right now, it's worth almost $100,000, so I don't think it's going away soon, and I think everybody's going to be coming around to that very soon themselves. Now, you've also mentioned about some of the difficulties getting through the different regulations or regulatory pressures that come with working with different governments, specifically the United States. Have you ever faced any direct pressures from regulators to kind of limit Xapo's Bitcoin offerings? And if so, how have you handled that?
The pressure doesn't, some countries famously, like maybe China, have said, right, we're banning Bitcoin, which is interesting because, Binance by volume for a long time was the largest exchange in the world, and most of that volume came from China. So clearly, because of the sovereignty of Bitcoin itself, it's very difficult for any government to impose any restrictions directly on Bitcoin. But what tends to happen is, governments will tend to put pressure on either the regulated financial institution or banks. So for me, that's where the largest pressure has always been, which is financial institutions being just dead scared to go anywhere near the space. And it's just, from a risk appetite perspective, it's just so much easier for them to say no than dip their toe in something that they know the regulator is going to be, dead against. So that's what I've seen the most. What I've seen the most is, regulators putting pressure on financial institutions to not work with the likes of a Xapo Bank.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let me ask you this. Bitcoin is often seen as a tool for financial inclusion, right? Does Xapo have plans to expand its services to underbanked regions, or is your focus right now mainly on high net worth individuals?
Well, we actually started off with that vision and that idea that we were going to serve the unbanked, that Bitcoin was something for everyone. And at our core, we still have that view. The challenge that we faced was, when you're essentially a startup trying to grow, if you serve everybody and you serve the unbanked and you serve the entire planet, your cost base is huge. And the reality is that then the lifetime value of some of those customers that you're going to have on your books is very little. So it's a great public service, but it just doesn't cover the costs. It doesn't cover your bills. So
makes sense.
We had to change our strategy and say, well, look, we've got, at one point we had something like 3 million customers, but out of which maybe 200,000 customers were active and only about half of those were profitable. So it's like, well, look, we still have to serve the other 3 million with a massive cost base, but we're never going to be profitable. We're under that business model. So
Sure.
we're almost forced into the economic reality that said, look, we can't serve everybody. Our services are not for everyone, not because we wouldn't want to, but because it's just not economically viable. Let's focus on those customers that have a meaningful number of Bitcoin, that really value the service, and that are willing to pay for it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Sometimes you just have to own that niche, and then once you have the capabilities to expand that out, then you do that then. But it sounds like you guys are taking the right track right now, which is focus on the people that really need your services the most, and that's people that hold large amounts of Bitcoin that need it to be protected and keep it secure. So that makes a lot of sense to me. I have one more question for you, because go ahead.
So I was just going to say, the other thing that's changed a lot is, remember, having been around since 2013, there weren't many Bitcoin wallets back then, right? So as a result, being early on, it was relatively easy to attract people that were interested in Bitcoin into something like Xapo, because there weren't many alternatives. But that's not true today, right? So for people who've got small amounts of Bitcoin, there are loads of alternatives all over the world that people in local markets can access. So it's not like, that we wouldn't want to serve that segment, but others can probably serve that segment better than us. So a bit like you said, it's better for us to focus, well, let's focus on our niche. Let's focus what we're good at. It might be boring, but we do it really well. And it's going to ensure the financial survival of the company, rather than being altruistic. We want to serve everybody, but we'll run out of cash in 3 years' time. So from a purely financial perspective, it wasn't an emotional decision, it was a financial one, but it's very clear that over time, those people are now probably better served by local providers who can also give them good services.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes being altruistic isn't always realistic, and it sounds like you guys have realized that early on and are making sure that you're just doing the best job serving the people that have confirmed that this is a product we need, and boring banking sounds great to me, so we might be talking later after the show. A couple more questions that I'm going to let you go, because I know your time is very valuable. Bitcoin's price cycles, not so dissimilar from the traditional markets, are influenced by public perception and adoption, but maybe even to a greater extent than we've experienced in stocks and other things like that. How does Xapo plan for long-term growth without being overly dependent on market cycles, specifically how Bitcoin goes through its own bull and bear runs every 3.5 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. We, at the end of the day, we're Bitcoiners, so every time we have to sell Bitcoin, it pains me to have to do it. Excuse me. But at the end of the day, we want to have as big a Bitcoin balance sheet as possible for a number of reasons. One is because, I believe that in 10 years' time, it'll be worth at least $1 million. So therefore, you've got the capital appreciation. But second, there's the risk management side of it, which is, well, because we hold people's Bitcoin, we need to be able to cover losses in the unfortunate event that we were to suffer some. You want the capital, the currency of your capital, and the asset that you're holding to be the same. So for us, we're always going to be native, natural Bitcoin holders and have a Bitcoin balance sheet. But of course, we also need to fund the business. So cash comes from the business itself, but also every quarter, we look at our cash inflows, cash outflows, and we look at what we think the price of Bitcoin might do. So we might hedge some of that exposure and just make sure that we got enough cash to fund operations. So we're always looking ahead in our treasury in making sure that our cash position is strong. We're looking at all of our needs, and that's something we've been doing for a long time and that we do quite well. So there's that short term. You can hedge with options. You can look at cash projections. There's that sort of short term, maybe I'd say up to 3 months treasury management. And then there's a longer term view. And the longer term view is I view Bitcoin as my capital, and therefore it's something that I protect, something that I conserve. I want to have as many Bitcoin as possible in the long run. So that's why we need to generate cash from our business activities so I don't have to consume my Bitcoin.
Yeah, you touched on a point that you hate selling your Bitcoin. It reminds me of our Lord and Savior, Michael Saylor, who always says, I hate selling Bitcoin because every time you do, you just made a $13 million mistake for the future. So I am definitely on board with that. And before I let you go, Seamus, you're a Bitcoiner, I'm a Bitcoiner. I always got to ask, the next 5 years, let's say 2030, what is your non-financial advice prediction for Bitcoin by 2030? What are the tea leaves telling you?
I think there are going to be many people out there that, depending on their view, might look at a chart and say, look at these peaks and all these aspects that are going to show this price. Other people do more sort of growth models to give you a price prediction. What I would say, and I've lived through it myself, is just don't sell. If you have a medium to long-term view on Bitcoin, the worst thing you can do is trade the short term. I've been burned by that. I'm sure you've been burned by that. So what I would say to anybody out there is, as long as you don't try and sell along the way and take profit, because you're never going to catch the all-time high, you're never going to catch the low. Just have a medium to long-term view, invest and forget about it. And if that's the sort of mindset with which you go in, which is here's an amount that I'm willing to invest as a part of a well-diversified portfolio, stick to the tenets of prudent investment management, the worst thing you can do is sell along the way. And I can almost guarantee you that if you hold it for 5 to 10 years, you will at least double your money. That's almost like, the safest, most boring prediction you can have. But there aren't many asset classes out there where anybody can give you that element of a guarantee that holding it for 5 to 10 years is almost like a guarantee that at some point in that trajectory, if you avoid the pitfalls of focusing on day-to-day price volatility, just because of the mere nature of how Bitcoin works and runs and operates, yes, there are going to be cycles. Just think medium to long term. It's impossible to lose. Just don't sell.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice for everybody. If you buy Bitcoin, you hold the Bitcoin, and then you put it in Xapo Bank to keep it nice and safe. Am I right?
Absolutely. And when life gets in the way, you need to transact, we're there.
We love it. So, Seamus, if people wanted to learn more about you and what you're doing and about Xapo Bank and all of the incredible tools that you offer to keep my beloved Bitcoin nice and safe, where can I send them?
XapoBank.com, just come to our website, have a browse around. We are always posting blogs on our website, on some of our media channels as well. But I think the website is probably the best place to go and just get a full picture of everything that we do. That's probably a good place to start. There's a few podcasts that I've done out there where I explain a lot about Xapo, what we're all about and what we're doing. So maybe look for one of those. But I think XapoBank.com is the best place for everybody to go.
Love it. Seamus, thank you so much for your time today. It was so insightful learning more about you and about Xapo Bank and how you are providing a nice, safe sanctuary for all of my beloved little Bitcoins and keeping them safe for me so I can sleep, nice and calmly at night. So we certainly appreciate your time, and we would love to have you back on the show at some point to tell us more about all the amazing tools you guys are developing over at Xapo Bank. Again, I appreciate you and your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, my friend.
You too. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for your time.
Pleasure was all mine. Talk to you soon. Thanks, Seamus. Have a good one. Well, that's a wrap with our deep dive with Seamus Rocca. Thank you, everyone, for checking out today's episode of the Blockchain Report. Make sure to like and subscribe to Roxham TV and Hank at Roxham TV on all platforms. And I'll see you tomorrow for more crypto chaos. Until then, hodl on.